So this is going to be a real quick intro into objects. I'm going to try to make this quick, but if anybody here has used JavaScript, you know there's a lot to talk about when it comes to objects. So with that being said, I'm going to start off with excuse me. This is a little demo I've set up here to go over a few different types of ways you can create objects. The first and most statically known method is known as an object initiator or literal. Sometimes people refer to them as singletons. It's basically just a pair of curly braces that are wrapped around some properties and methods. The good thing about using an object literal is that it's very fast, it's very concise, and it's easy to read. At the same time, you don't get the flexibility of inheritance like with creating an object from a class. These are more statically types of objects. There's some comments down here about how property is a primitive and my method is a function, so you want to be careful about how you're passing them when you're using them within other objects. Another way you can see that an object initializer can be used is by actually assigning it a function, which then returns an object. But the nice thing about this methodology is that you are allowing yourself some what are considered private properties of that class or object. In this case, we have one private variable label, LBL. As you can see, though, that when you instantiate my object class, you wind up returning an object with a label that's concatenated to that other label. So it's a little bit different than the private variable that's going to be the same for any other object you create there. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Let's see. And here's another form of creating an object. We have an object constructor. This is more of how you would typically go about creating objects with inheritance involved. So you want to basically create a class that contains some properties and methods that you're going to be able to use on other objects throughout your code. Again, I'm using a small example of some pseudo-private properties in the beginning of this class. It's followed by actually maybe a little too much code here, but there's a couple different examples of how you can assign properties using the this keyword. The this keyword is used within a constructor to allow for the new operator to be used. So when you when you create an object based on this class, you use the new operator, and you can pass it some default properties or that are going to be assigned to that object. In here, you'll see that there's a few properties. There's some methods like get and setters. We see that over here. These are very typical patterns for creating objects. We also see here that if we want inheritance, we want to assign a property to that class. So before we go ahead and instantiate any objects off of the class, you always want to make sure you're assigning its property first and foremost if you want to do any inheritance. If you happen to assign a prototype after you've created some objects, as you see in the next line, you're going to wind up not having those properties assigned to that object. And we can see some minor tests down here. Here's another method to create an object in JavaScript. This is a little bit newer. It's still not a valid way to create objects within IE8, but as we're all hoping and know, the days of IE8 are coming to a close. So this is a standard way to create objects now. All browsers are implementing it pretty much the same. It's from the ECMAScript 5th edition, so it's been out there in the spec for a while. There are some ways you can get very granular here, but basically you want to just use object.create and pass it a prototype, so it'll inherit some properties. And you can see that a couple of different usages here. This is one way you can assign properties as well. You can create a static, as we saw earlier, an object literal. You can do that here and pass properties as a prototype to the object. So this is just one way you can do it, but it's a lot cleaner if you just need a few basic properties that are going to be inherited by a bunch of objects. And then I wanted to talk about prototypal property assignment. There's a lot of issues around this with some code. Again, I want to reiterate that you need to assign the prototype ahead of time before you start instantiating any classes off of an object. Sorry, an object constructor. Afterward, you can, however, do myClass.prototype.getInstances or any other property or method you want, and those will be inherited by any objects that were instantiated earlier. So as long as you've assigned the prototype ahead of time, you can actually add new properties and methods to any instantiated objects after the fact, and they will be inherited. This, on the other hand, is an example of an occasional mistake that some programmers make, where you're assigning a property to an object and you're not necessarily considering that it's not going to be inherited by other objects that were based on that class. And here's two other, these are two other issues I wanted to bring up, which is delete, the keyword delete, and also assigning null to a property. When you use the keyword delete on a property, and you're only supposed to use it on a, not a built-in object, but only objects that you've created in your own code. If you use delete on that property, it will remove it. What it does is it actually removes a reference to that property in memory. So what happens is it allows the garbage collection to work a little bit more efficiently. And I hate to bash on IE again, but we all know we have memory issues there too. Now, if you want to get rid of an entire object, the preferred method is to actually just assign it null. Again, you're removing the reference to that object in memory. It'll clean it up. You just have to make sure that none of your other code is using it. And let's see. I have some notes here, but do I still have time? I'm good? Okay. Well, that's it.